Alright, so, um, I'm gonna be, doing a little bit on, this guy. I think you might have heard of him. His name is, J.J. McGregor, or, sorry, J-Reg, whatever. Um, but yeah, uh, he has been commonly following for his Centricide series. Okay, that's pen's not working. Yeah, we must get a pen to work. Yeah. Okay. He's commonly been pushing this. Well, one, he kind of doesn't technically agree with it, but because he's saying, belief is complicated, and you can't just map it onto a 40 chart. But even the 40 chart he's using, he hasn't really, hasn't really challenged the nature of the 2D chart, which is essentially puts it into 4 quadrants. I'm not gonna do it lib. And yeah, so let me just see. So then let's see if this is a red. Nope. Come on. Gotta get some of these red pens to work. Fucking A. Hevla. Okay. So Alright. Yeah, and then let's see. Yellow. Let go my yellow. What should we do for yellow? Those folks. Okay, Alright, so basically, it's this little chart deal. So kind of this chart deal. So you've got, oh yeah, well, technically I made it like this. So you've got authoritarians up here. You've got communists. You've got essentially right-wing Nazis. And then you've got your anarcho-communists. Then you've got libertarians with barely legible yellow pencil. So yeah. Now he wants to envision, okay, so this is essentially the general 2D. This is the 2 spectrum. This is the economic spectrum of political theory. I mean, it's simple. Well, he says that's too simple. But he doesn't even distinguish that much simplicity, because I would disagree with that chart, not merely because it's too simple, but because even its simplicity is kind of, how shall I say this, inaccurate. Alright, so, what do I think is accurate? So let's do do. Now this isn't going to be a perfect drawing, but generally, okay. So you've got left, you've got right, you've got left, you've got right, and then you've got the center. And here's communism, and then you've got ANCAPs. Essentially, this is, I would say, a more accurate representation of the political spectrum. You see, you've got left-wing politics over here. You've got right-wing politics in here, and in the center, you've got things like communists on the extreme, and then you've got on the extreme center over here, and then you've got ANCAPs on the extreme center over here. Because left-wing, as he mentions in his own video, is left-wing versus right-wing is proclivity towards hierarchies and centralization. Left-wing wants the most left-wing position, anarcho-communism, basically advocates for the abolition of all states and hierarchies, and everyone is equal to each other, everyone has the same amount of power. That is essentially full leftism. Then you've got on the right, which is a fascist dictatorship with basically where everyone basically is in control of, or basically the state or a select few people that the fascist dictator allows to be in control are in control, and everything, and it's basically he controls all types of stuff. So basically, what you have is and then the center extremism, which is communism and anarcho-capitalism, is basically centrists because, in my view, they kind of end up at the same point, because you see, that arm's getting tired, because you see, communism is basically a type of left. It's similar to left wing, but only in theory anyway, mostly. But they're right wing in practice, which makes them very a center extremist. Because communists want to seek equality of people, but not and collective ownership of the means of production, not through literally giving every single person a part ownership in every single company. No, they want collective ownership in the sense that the state owns it, which means technically everyone owns it, but in practicality, only the people running the state own it. So the people are largely at the mercy of the state, which in essence gives rise to state capitalism. The same criticism could be said of anarcho-capitalism, but except it's much more of an honest way of getting there, whereas people follow communism to get to here, but communism just gets you centrist extremism, which is the same as anarcho-capitalism. They are essentially the same, except they take two completely different approaches to get there. So, because essentially what anarcho-capitalist reforms do is essentially free up all of business regulation so that businesses end up getting to control the world. And they merge until eventually you've got it all merged down into one overarching company with so much economic control that they are basically the government. They basically control every aspect of your life, and and their board of directors and CEO is essentially like communism's committee of members, and the CEO of the company is basically the chairman of the nation. It's similar. They basically end up at similar plots, and then centrism is sort of like keeping the bounds between communism and narco-capitalism. That's neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is saying, okay, we're not going here, we're not going there, we're just going to keep it here. And then, of course, right wing says we're going to go further towards hierarchy control, which essentially is much more similar towards dictatorship, except there. But then here is like we're gonna go more towards no state, no hierarchies, just people. And so that doesn't really work. So essentially, you could think of it as like somewhat of a globe, where I think to some extent, I don't know how full right wingism and left wingism could wrap around to be each other, but you could definitely see the connection between communism and anarcho-capitalism, how they wrap around to essentially become each other, because whatever your situation is, whether you're anarcho-capitalist or you're a communist, you're both going to end up at state capitalism, because eventually authoritarian communism is essentially means that the ownership is going to be comprised of very few individuals who actually run the state. And anarcho-capitalism says, no, the state isn't going to get control. Businesses are going to have full control, but eventually the free market will but eventually with no state intervention, what's going to happen is eventually we're all just going to have one single company that's just going to essentially become the state, and then we eventually work our way back to state capitalism. So yeah, that is essentially how things are going to work. Now, where would I plot social libertarianism? It's a very how shall I say it? It's very subjective where you plot. Now you can get to the objective points of these concepts, but then when plotting sort of middle of the road concepts, it's very subjective as to where you place these things on the graph when they're not specific points, when they're not the specific endpoints. All right, so social libertarianism is generally more of a left-wing ideology. I would consider it to be maybe about here. Oh yeah, and then let's go with the Overton window right about here. All right. So yeah, that's the center. I would say social libertarianism is about right there on the political spectrum. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't go complete anarchist, but it does go pretty darn far. At least in its most extreme interpretations, I guess you could say. But yeah. Generally, that's how, political spectrums should be going. And yeah. And anyone that says, oh, communism was left-wing. No, it was centrist. Communism is centrist. Okay? Communism is a centrist. It is extreme, but it's an extreme centrist ideology. And then what else is it? There's anarcho-capitalism, another extreme centrist ideology. Practically the same result as communism, except different ways of going there. Because instead of, it's a bit more gradual it's a bit more gradual than authoritarian communism, but eventually the end result is the same, because eventually all power will be consolidated into one corporation, and that corporation is going to, through mergers and acquisitions, and that corporation is going to effectively become the state. Now, it might not become the state officially, and so technically it's still an anarcho-capitalist society, but generally speaking, it is going to be state capitalism, because it just so happens that instead of the state being, the technically public state that's doing the authoritarianism, it is the private state that's doing the authoritarianism. And so yeah, uh, anarcho-capitalism, communism, uh, same shit, except I would argue anarcho-capitalism is much more honest in terms of its, uh, selling point. Communism is for the people, whereas anarcho-capitalism is, I want to make more money. Anything that makes me more money is good. And so because of that, it's like, hey, I want to make the most amount of money, so I'm going to make the most amount of acquisitions possible to basically control the state, and basically become the state. And that my company controls all aspects, so we can make in the most amount of money. And that essentially is state capitalism. So in that sense, anarcho-capitalism is a much more honest way of achieving communism. Or essentially what communism will become. Because the only legitimate way of achieving communism is to not be authoritarian at any point in time. The way to achieve real communism, essentially anarcho-communism, is to whenever you implement communist reforms, those reforms can never put, really, can almost never put state ownership for like companies. You can never do state ownership for companies. Now, insurance, and healthcare, that's a different thing, but like say if you're going to make public ownership of ExxonMobil. No, what instead you need to do is put like the workers of ExxonMobil in charge of ExxonMobil, and essentially making everything a worker-owned co-op. The state, and then the workers control it, and they have authority over that. The state doesn't have authority over it. Essentially, that would be a much more way to achieve anarcho-communism, because the authoritarian communism works when basically the workers, they still do the work, except it's just a change in, instead of their employer telling them to work or else they don't eat, it's the communist dictator telling them to do that. So yeah, that's essentially the difference between, say, that's the real way you should interpret the left to right wing spectrum, instead of the version you see on the political compass. Because this dealio right here, this little dealio, should be the new political spectrum. International. Diagonal. You've got left wing, you've got right wing, then you've got anarcho-capitalism and communism. Essentially, complete and utter right-wing fascism, complete and utter left-wing utopia. Then you've got communism, which takes elements from both right-wing and the left-wing, which is hierarchical state control, but also with quote-unquote ideals of equality. And then you've got anarcho-capitalism, which takes, the idea of being free and don't tread on me from the left-wing side, but also the hierarchical systems of corporations from the right-wing side. And you similarly get, a similar stance, in which case the anarchos, essentially the people who got the most successful in anarcho-capitalist society essentially become the state and become the authoritarian state capitalists, just like the leaders of the government become the state capitalists in a communist society. So yeah, that was my 20-minute rant on political compass and what should be the legitimate compass. So yeah, hopefully you gained some insight into, that deal. Alright. Bye!